Hey everyone, let's talk about the microbes that we'll be studying this semester. So we're going to look at bacteria, which are super common. There are more bacteria on Earth than there are any type of animal cell on Earth. But they're not probably as well studied as mammals because, well, if there's fewer mammals, you can identify all of them. And we haven't identified all the mammals either on Earth. Um, so we're going to look at the bacteria that interact with mammals. We'll look at, and we do focus mainly on bacteria that are associated with animals. I don't really look at bacteria that are associated with plants a lot, but we will look a little bit at that. We're going to look at organisms in the eukaryote group as well. We're not really going to study a lot of prokaryotic organisms in our lab, but we will learn a little bit about prokaryotic organisms. The three domains that we have are bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. So when you think of prokaryotic organisms, this includes your bacteria and your archaea. They tend to be smaller. They tend to be less complex. They have one circular single-stranded chromosome of DNA, whereas eukaryotes tend to have multiple chromosomes, and eukaryotic chromosomes tend to be linear. The examples of prokaryotic organisms are bacteria and Eukarya for archaea, okay? Whereas eukaryotes are much more complex. They have a large nucleus. They have a nucleolus where ribosomes are formed. They have multiple organelles, and this is where we find most of the organisms that are studied, but that doesn't mean that these are the most common organisms. Like I said, bacteria outnumber mammals by a number of like 1,000 or 10,000. I mean, there's so many more bacterial cells than there are animal cells. So bacteria are single-celled prokaryotic organisms. So this is the first domain we're going to look at. They do not have a nucleus. They don't have typical membrane-bound organelles. They have DNA that's found in a region known as the nucleoid. The most common shape of bacteria is going to be either rod or spherical or spiral shaped. They have a rigid cell wall in general. So I always say that because there is one example that's going to not contain that rigid cell wall. But they usually have a rigid cell wall that contains peptidoglycan, and they reproduce via binary fission. And again, that's typically what you find. The domain bacteria contains the majority of bacteria that we will study this semester. Some are motile, some are non-motile. If they are motile, they typically have flagella that allows them to move around. They can be found in all regions of the world, so every region of the earth. They are commonly found on the human, so we are a good ecosystem for bacteria. Most bacteria that live in and on us do not cause infection, but they can cause infection, and a lot of the disease-causing agents are bacteria. They're always single-celled, and like I said, the rod and the circular are the two most common shapes, but spiral shape is not uncommon. Archaea are also single-celled organisms. They also have no membrane-bound nucleus. They also have no membrane-bound organelles. They have a nucleoid region where their single circular strand of DNA is going to be found. They differ from bacteria in that they do not have peptidoglycan in their rigid cell wall. They do have a rigid cell wall, though. They can be multiple shapes, but the most common shapes are, again, rod and sphere. They do have spirals. Your archaea can be extremophiles, so they can live in some of the most extreme environments, hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the ocean, the great salt flats. They can live in the Dead Sea. They can live in a lot of different areas, okay? And this is just a picture of methanogens. Methanogens are a special type of archaea that convert carbon dioxide into methane. And then we have our Eukarya. So these are the organisms that are the most commonly researched. And so we know most or more about these guys than we do the other two groups. All eukaryotes have membrane-bound nucleus and have multiple organelles. They are much more complex. Their DNA typically are going to be double-stranded and linear versus circular. They use most, I won't say all, but many eukaryotes have two chromosomes for two different chromosomes for one from each parent because they reproduce sexually. Bacteria and archaea cannot reproduce sexually. Eukarya are separated into 4 kingdoms: Protista, Fungi, Plantae, and Animalia. And the ones that we tend to look at are going to be the fungi, the algae, and the protozoans. And then we'll also look at some unicellular or multicellular organisms, and the ones that we'll look at there are going to be your helminthic organisms. Okay. So let's look at the protozoans. Protozoans are a very diverse group. They are a very they are not a very good taxonomic group. Typically when we put an organism in a group, we don't want to change that organism, and we want everything to stick together effectively. Protozoans are constantly changing. So now every single year it seems like we're reclassifying protozoans. At one point we classified protozoans based on their mode of motility. So how did they get around? Now we're using more DNA and RNA to classify organisms or the protozoans. But some things that are always the same about protozoans is they are larger, single-celled organisms. They're always single-celled. They are larger than prokaryotic organisms. They do not have a cell wall. They are motile in general. Most of them are motile. And most do not cause disease. But that's not different from bacteria, because most bacteria don't cause disease either. Algae can be single-celled or multicellular. But they are always photosynthetic. Algae contain chloroplasts, which have chlorophyll inside of them. Algae live in water. They have a rigid cell wall. And some have flagella that allow them to move around. The flagella that they have differ from the flagella in prokaryotic organisms. Fungi are also able to be either single-celled or unicellular. So single-celled fungi are known as yeasts. Multicellular fungi are known as molds. And so this is a perfect example of multicellular fungi here. And this is showing some yeasts that are replicating and they're forming large colonies together. Fungi live on land. They don't tend to live in water, but they do like moist environments. They are heterotrophs, which means they require organic materials to survive, so they absorb nutrients. They have structures known as hyphae that allow them to suck up all the nutrients in the environment so that they can then grow better. So when we classify organisms in in the eukaryotic domain, we start with that domain. Then we have a kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. So this is the most inclusive. So this includes all organisms that have a nucleus. Down here, it only includes organisms that are the exact same species. So like Homo sapien would be an example. We use binomial nomenclature when we're naming organisms. So the binomial system of nomenclature includes your genus and your specific epithet. So the genus is always going to be that first word in your binomial name. And then the specific epithet is that species name. So for humans, we are Homo sapien. Homo is always capitalized, it's the genus. The species name is always lowercase. And then you're always going to either italicize or underline any Latin name using the binomial nomenclature system. So example, Escherichia coli right here. You would either have to have it italicized or you're going to put an underline under it. You can abbreviate with the first letter and then the last name. So we always, most of you have probably heard of E. coli. Not as many of you have probably heard of Escherichia coli. Escherichia coli and E. coli are the exact same. It's just we use the abbreviation. Okay. The last group of microbes that we always like to talk about are those non-living members. So this includes viruses, viroids, and prions. Viruses are acellular infectious agents. These are non-living. Viruses have no cell. Living things are composed of cells, and only cells can produce cells. Therefore, viruses are not alive. But viruses have a lot of characteristics that living things have. So they do share characteristics. This table just distinguishes viruses, viroids, and prions. Okay. Viruses have either DNA or RNA, but only DNA or RNA, never both, packed in a protein coat. These viruses can be in multiple shapes. Viruses can infect all living things, including bacteria. We have viruses that infect bacteria. These are known as bacterial viruses or bacteriophages. Once they infect the host, they use the host machinery to replicate. If they're not inside of the host, then they are inactive. So they are known as obligate intracellular parasites. Viroids are simpler than viruses. Viroids only contain RNA. They can't contain DNA or RNA. It's always RNA. They do not have a protein coat that surrounds them, but they also do not cause human diseases. They do cause plant diseases. So viroids are known to be plant disease causers. Prions then are infectious proteins. They're basically a protein in the body that has folded incorrectly. And this is found in the brain, so it affects your nervous tissue. And once one protein folds improperly, it causes other proteins to start folding improperly. And this causes large lesions in your brain that then lead to a lot of neurodegenerative problems. And it is deadly. Prions have no treatment. So a prion disease is going to end in death of the individual, of the organism, I should say it that way. I am done. So we have finished all of chapter 1. I'll have these posted. I'll have your chapter posted, and I'll get into chapter 3 next. Bye.